Hi guys, my name is Kirsty. Welcome back to Upside Down Books. Today we're going to be looking at the great successes in my reading life that I had in January. So if you might have noticed, I didn't post for a couple of weeks. I apologize for the small delay in the filming there. That was partially to do with a few reasons, but namely to do with getting a cork nearly into my eye and having a bit of a unseemly face for a while, so that's recovered and now we're back. But more importantly, my reading goal is on track. Technically it was on track on the 31st of January. It's now the 2nd of February and we may be one book behind again, but we're not looking at February just yet, so we're going to say that I am on track. I have set myself a reading challenge of 95 books for 2020 and I'm honestly really impressed and proud of my efforts to reach this goal. It basically means I need to read like 7.5 books every month. So I've been telling myself I need to read 8 books every month and I read 7 in January and that is solid, a really good effort for me. That took a lot of effort, no, I'm not gonna lie, it was a bit of hard work. I was aided by the fact that I was partway through a book at the beginning of the month rolling on from December and also partway through a big audiobook, but that's fine, we're just gonna see how February goes and hopefully it's not a total disaster. I actually really enjoyed all the books that I read in January, which was amazing as always, but it wasn't as stellar as I was expecting. I'm usually a really easy rater, but I found myself rating the books really harsh in January, so let's go through and have a look at what I read. So the first book that I started the month off with was Firelight by Sophie Jordan, and this was a really interesting and sort of light-hearted read, but total trash, and I loved it. I ended up rating it about 3 out of 5 stars, I'm pretty sure. I will need to check this. Yes, so I rated this one 3 out of 5 stars. It was really good, it was just very fluffy. It's very young, very tweeny. It was a book that I received from one of my friends at Christmas time and I've really wanted to read for the longest of times because it's about dragon shifters. So it's set in America and basically they're dragon shifters and they're in hiding and there's a lot of terrible, unhealthy insta romance happening that was just hilarious to read about. So I powered through this one because sometimes you just need some binge-worthy trashy books to make you happy. I then moved on to some poetry. So it isn't poetry, it was just a book written in prose, and I don't do this very often, but this is suddenly becoming something I'm finding myself reading more often. And that book was Inside Out and Back Again by Thanalai, probably saying that wrong. Now this was an amazing book. I rated this one 3 out of 5 stars again, which in hindsight feels a little bit harsh, but whilst it was a really good and interesting book, very powerful, very topical, it didn't like 100% blow me away. I would definitely recommend reading it, but it's I don't know, for some reason I just 3 stars felt adequate for this book. So this is all about Vietnamese refugees. So following the Vietnam War, or sort of during the Vietnam War, and the main characters in this have this, well, the main character in this is actually really young and it's her way of describing the differences between her 2 worlds and her journey from Vietnam to the United States. Can't remember for the life of me which state she ends up in now, but it's a really powerful and interesting way of looking at refugees and immigrants, sort of the way that they're treated and accepted by people in the country that they're arriving in, and I thought it was a really powerful book and it was super quick to read because it is written in prose. There's not always a lot of text on each page. I then very excitedly moved on to reading The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, and I have to say I was like a little bit disappointed. Like, this was almost too happy an ending for me for this series. This series has been phenomenal the whole way through. The Cruel Prince blew my mind. The Wicked King was even better, and then this wasn't blowing my mind quite so much. It was a very diplomatic sort of end to the series where everybody is sort of gets their nice tied up storyline. I'm not going to say much more for those of you that haven't read it. I did still rate it 4 out of 5 stars. It was still enjoyable to read. I think Holly Black could have easily made this a whole lot bigger, if not double the size, and really fleshed out some of the drama. But Jude is such a fantastic character. She's very sassy and relatable, so I thought that was great, but I guess I was surprised that the story ended so soon. Yeah, I could have, would have, and should have. I could have and would have enjoyed a little bit more out of this story in the end. But also, this is great progress towards one of my yearly goals for this year, which is to finish off series. So that is one series I have finished for this year already. So I'm getting lots of golden stars for my efforts in January. Okay, I then moved on to something that I was quite critical about but really enjoyed. I rated it 3 or 3.5 stars out of 5. I have to check because I can literally never remember. Yeah, just 3. So I rated this one 3 out of 5 stars because whilst I really enjoyed it, it didn't quite live up to other books that are also the same retelling of this story. So this is a retelling of 1001 Nights, and of course that means that this is 1000 Nights, and I have read 2 other retellings of this story before now, and the bar has been set quite high. So I've had my eye on this one for a long time. I don't know how long ago it was released. It's relatively new, but there's obviously Renee Ardier's series, which is the Wrath and the Dawn series, which is a phenomenal duology that I cannot recommend enough. I'm still in love and just, oh, I need to reread that one, honestly. And then I recently read like a real sort of, it almost looked like an erotica story. It was just one of those weird little like Highlander vibed ones peeping out of the bookshelf. And that was The Storyteller's Daughter. Can't remember who that one's by though. And that was like an itty bitty little book, but it was also a retelling of it, and I think it was almost better done than 1,000 Nights, which is kind of harsh. I'll tell you what my problem with this one was. It was a fantastic story. It had wonderful magic elements to this story that have not been there before in this sense. We have the traditional tale of a prince who is every dawn marrying a new girl from his kingdom, and every sunset she is executed because of this curse that's on him. And the main character, whose name is usually some sort of variation of Shahrazad from the original, is the one that manages to stay alive for quite a long time. Insert story there. And this was good, but there was a lack of storytelling. So the idea of this book is to make you wonder whether this is just a story that is similar to the traditional one we know, or whether this is a story within Shahrazad's story. So as if this is one of the stories that Shahrazad tells the prince in the original. Story within a story. It's like a cool inception, but only really suggested at the very end of the book, so it kind of felt a bit superfluous and didn't really impact the story at all for me. Anyway, point aside, it was good, but there was almost no storytelling aspects in this. We never really get any chapters in the book where we sit down with Shahrazad, or whatever her name is, and who is talking to the prince, and we don't really understand why he doesn't kill her. Like, we do, but it's not very compelling. So I enjoyed reading this on the whole. I thought there were some fascinating side characters. The side characters were pretty awesome, and her sister was fantastic. The setting was super cool, set in this desert, and how people survived in this super harsh land, and the contrast between that and the Quasir, the prince's lodgings, castle thing. But yeah, overall, the actual bones of this story that should have been the strongest and best part I found were lacking. So we're going to leave it at a happy 3 stars. I would totally reread this story. It was that enjoyable, but not what I was expecting. Not what I was expecting. So I then finished an audiobook that I have been reading for several months. I started it probably November, and I've just sort of not got anywhere with it because it was really long, it was really confusing, and then lots of things were happening for me, so that was just a lot to do. And that was The Name of All Things by Jen Lyons. Now this is the sequel, second book in the Song of the Dragons Quartet, or whatever that's called. Chorus of Dragons. I didn't enjoy this quite as much as the first book. Again, this was 3 out of 5 stars. It was really good. I need to reread this. So I read the first book in physical format, and the way that this book is written requires a lot of effort to read. You may have heard this already. Would recommend pausing when you get confused to watch other people's reviews to help you sort of nut it out. There's lots of footnotes in it, there's lots of genealogy trees at the back and other things that help you piece it together, because the fun of this book is the fact that it is a little bit harder to read in that you've got to piece things together. And I did the second one via audiobook thinking it would be easier because I could just sit back and let someone else do the work for me, but didn't really work out that way. I ended up being more confused because I couldn't go back easily enough to reread, and I didn't have the genealogy tree or any of the charts, and sometimes when the narrator used a similar voice for the character who is writing the footnotes, it was just hard to sometimes understand when it was a footnote and when it was actually part of the story, because it wasn't like footnote and then said it. It just changed voice, and you've got to kind of contextually work out. You can see why I struggled with this book. So the plan is to digest this, to think on it, and then I'm going to go and buy myself the physical copy and reread this probably before I read the next book in the series, because I'm loving it. It's a wicked fantasy series, but I think that one should probably be reading it and not listening to it. Anyway, moving on to the next book. So I then moved on and actually started ticking off. I've been doing a really good job with ticking off my goals for 2020. Can we just appreciate this? Because I started rereading and finished rereading Crown of Midnight by Sarah J. Maas. And I forgot how good this was again. When I reread the novellas, they were relatively fresh in my mind for some reason, so I wasn't surprised by those. The first book shocked me by how much I loved it, but I forgot how this one actually ends, and it's like devastatingly amazing. And I'm so excited. And because I have the paperbacks in books 1 and 2 and the novellas, I have actually treated myself and bought myself the hardback copy. So I'm going to have a full hardback set, which I will show you because I'm going to be doing a bookshelf tour relatively soon. So look out for that one. This one was my 5-star read of the month. It was actually my highest rated book. just about. Most of my books for this month were 3 stars, so I really enjoyed rereading this. This didn't actually take me too long to read when I actually set aside the time to read it, but I've got a little bit distracted throughout the month doing things like watching The Handmaid's Tale and a hospital series called New Amsterdam, if you've heard of that one. Been very busy with the TV this month. I can't wait. I have to say I'm a little bit nervous to read book 3, which is Air of Fire, because I remember when I read this for the first time, that was when I found the series slowed down for me, and just until basically I petered out and I stopped reading at the one after Queen of Shadows. Can't remember what that one, Empire of Storms, because I've not read the last 2 books, which is the whole point of me reading this series, is to refresh it and get through it. So I'm very nervous, and I will hopefully get to the end of February and have some sort of report on how book 3 went, but we will see how things go. So the last book that I read was actually another audiobook, and that was Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, and another one that wasn't quite what I was expecting, and perhaps because I had been comparing it quite highly to some other mythological books I've been reading. Now, I don't know much about Norse mythology. I know a lot more about Greek mythology. I touched on that when I was studying quite a lot, am familiar with the stories, have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and sort of know what to expect, which meant when I read Stephen Fry's series of mythos and heroes, I knew how much of the story he was relating, like what bits I hadn't heard yet and he hadn't written about. And I mean that in the sense that when I was reading Norse Mythology by Neil Gaiman, I didn't understand if that was all of the stories. I don't know. I don't even know what texts you read Norse mythology from, where that comes from, if there's anything written about them. Because it was really interesting, it was really well done, but it was quite short, and I wanted to know more. Like, I want to know if there's more stories to hear, or if that is sort of everything. So I'm left with a lot of questions at the end of it, so I ended up just reading it 3 out of 5 stars. Really good book and really easy to read, but I came out with more questions than I went into, which was a bit of a shame, I found. But those are all the books that I got around to in January, so that left me on track for achieving a reading of 95 books for the year, which is super exciting. Looking forwards into February, I am making my way through my next reads already, coming up to finishing a couple of other books, or halfway through a couple of books, but I haven't laid myself out a TBR, which I did actually do. All those books were planned for January, so I have a few arcs that are a bit thicker. So these 2 books here, which I've been sent by Penguin for review, and I need to get around to reading those, and that's Jane in Love and Agency. So I'm a bit nervous that these ones might hold me up a bit, depending on how good they are. So hopefully they don't, but I do need to get around to those, so you can expect to see those in my wrap-up for February. But other than that, I'm going to stop rambling, and I will see you in my next video. Goodbye.